off. The ark is closed. You may be seated. And as you know, we have a lot of guest speakers, darshanim, and during the summer months. And so it's my great pleasure to invite Toby Schonfeld up to give our drash today.
Shabbat Shalom. I read a lot. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. I've always got at least 3 books going, one on my Kindle, one audiobook, one made of actual paper in our house. Actually, now that I think about it, I've got at least 4 going, one in the living room and one in the bedroom. I read in the evenings after dinner, like many people, but I also read when I walk the dog, I read when I cook, I read when I commute, doubly so, actually. I read my Kindle on the metro, and when I reach one stop before my destination, I put my Kindle away, I put in my AirPods so that I can listen to a different book on the 3-block walk to my office. So I'm not kidding when I say I read a lot. Mitchell's my Goodreads buddy. I think I'm up to 61 so far this year, or something like that. So I have been a reader as far back as I can remember. My parents tell me I started reading at age 3, and I never stopped. I have fond memories of the hour-long car ride home from my grandparents' house when I was growing up, pressing my face against the window to catch whatever light I could of the twilight. Some of you who are around my age remember that, right, before phones. And then I also have some not-so-fond memories of my parents yelling at me to stop reading because I was going to ruin my eyes, right, or because we were going to be late for something, or because they wanted me to get out of the house and get some fresh air, because I was always reading. What's that about? I'm not entirely sure. It is certainly the case that books open up worlds that we could not always experience on our own. Fantastical places, interesting people, bold actors, and quiet resistors. It's also the case that books can give us an opportunity to escape whatever it is in our lives that is hard or complicated or painful. And reading allows us, at least for a time, to immerse ourselves in an environment so dramatically different from our own that we can gain some needed distance from our troubles. Distance that, if we are lucky, provides us with the time and space to address whatever is going on in the real world. And sometimes, books are just fun. I will never forget being with my friend Mark at Barnes & Noble for the release of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. There were kids of all ages, dressed up, reciting their favorite passages, trying to predict where Harry's quest would take him next, and talking about the characters as if they were dear friends. Mark, a professional educator, and I were marveling at the renewed wonder in everyone's faces and at the obsession with reading that a whole new generation was enjoying, courtesy of the imagination of a single mother trying to give her daughter a fantastical world that would help her escape, just for a little while, the troubled one in which she was living. So, whatever the reason, reading is my bliss. It's my thing, it is what I do. And what that means is that pretty much anything that happens in the real world connects me to something I've read before, and often in different ways. Sadly, I've said more than once over these 2 years of the pandemic, I have read this dystopian novel, and it does not end well for any of us. Anyway, so when I volunteered to deliver a Dvar Torah, I figured I should just choose whatever date worked best for us, since it didn't matter which parsha I chose, because every time I read something, it sparked an idea on something else I read, right? I mean, it's all good, unless it's the parsha about leprosy. We're done with that. Or the dimensions of the tabernacle, or the census. Oops, right? Because you know that guy, Pinchas, for whom this parsha is named? Yeah, all of his actions were last week, right? So this is about what happens afterward. Who's still around after the plague, so we know how to divide up the land. Super exciting stuff. And of course, this is the third year of the triennial, right? So we didn't even read that. As Melanie told us, we read the calendar today, right? So even better. But when I started reading, right, you start at the beginning. So I started at the beginning with the census, and it reminded me of something I had read. Yom Kippur, 2010 or 2011. I'm alone in Atlanta. James was in Atlanta or DC, or he was in Omaha or DC, I forget where he was at the time. I couldn't sleep that afternoon. So I pull a paperback off my shelf. It was a book that I had put on my Amazon wish list some time ago, and my best friend sent it to me saying, "This sounds awful, but you say you want it, so have a good time." It was an obscure fantasy novel whose description intrigued me, called Game of Thrones. I remember sitting in our living room, sun was streaming in, I was about 150 pages in, marveling that this guy, George R.R. Martin, was still introducing new characters at that point. Boy, did I have a lot to learn about his writing style. All of them had weird names and origin stories it was just about impossible to keep straight. And out of nowhere, the main character, Ned Stark, for those of you playing along at home, gets killed. Right? I remember thinking, okay, dream sequence or some other common plot device. Remember, I read a lot. And so I wasn't really worried until I kept reading and reading. And he was actually dead, right? Martin had just killed off the main guy, 150 pages into a novel where I had come to be invested in the character. He's just gone. And here are more characters, more backstories, more weird names that I'm somehow supposed to learn and know and process, and whoa, right? Now, I was admittedly weak of body and mind at that point, having fasted for about 15 hours, but that particular reading experience has stayed with me for several reasons. For one, it's hard to surprise me with plot twists. That's a consequence of being a voracious reader, right? It doesn't mean I always know what's coming. But once it happens, I'm often able to reconcile the turn of the story with something I had known, even subconsciously, and I'm often delighted or annoyed or resigned to a set of actions. But I'm rarely surprised. But more than that, I think, is that what Martin did by killing off the person in whom I was invested was make me think differently about the world he had created. Should I have paid more attention to those other people? Yes, it turns out. Were there others who were going to jump to the fore? And perhaps more importantly, how do I know in whom to invest so that I'm not hurt again? The answer, nobody. Little did I know that in two more books there would be the Red Wedding. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, see me at Kiddush, because oh my goodness. Okay. Now, this is fiction, and in Martin's imagination, anything is possible. But isn't this actually the question that we often ask ourselves, especially recently? How do I know in whom to invest? What could we know? What should we know in order to prepare ourselves for what's to come? Many of you know that I'm a bioethicist, and it's my privilege to work for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, serving our nation's heroes. This seems particularly relevant for Parshat Pinchas, where, after all, the census was not of all the people. It was of those who were able to bear arms, future soldiers to a person, and we get them when the soldiering is done. There are 23 million veterans alive in the U.S. today. The Veterans Health Administration is America's largest integrated healthcare system, providing care at 1,300 healthcare facilities, including 171 medical centers and 1,100 outpatient sites of care, serving 9 million enrolled veterans each year. That's our census. That's how we know how to divide up the land, as it were, for VA care. But what we also know is that each veteran is an individual. Not unlike Martin's characters, each person has a backstory, a network of relationships, and a context in which they are living. It is knowing those things about a person that tells you who they are and what they need. It is this recognition that each veteran is a complex combination of shared service experiences and unique service experiences that has caused our whole health program to shift the focus from what's the matter with you to what matters to you. What matters to you? Our job at the National Center for Ethics in Healthcare is to address uncertainty about values and to help resolve values conflicts. To simplify a complex concept, values are what matters to you. What serves as the basis for the choices you make? How do you see yourself in the world? And about what and about whom do you care? Sometimes people think of us, ethicists, as the pull the plug people. We get a bad rap that way. Is it the case that sometimes an ethics consultation results in the withholding or withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment? It is. But when it is because those actions are consistent with the values of the patient, given how they have lived their lives, given their priorities, choices, and values. What is the course of action that honors them? What is the way to best enable them to continue authentically to be themselves? We see veterans who say things like, my battle buddies never gave up on me, and I'm not ready to give up on myself. If I need help, you give it to me. Do everything you can to make me better. And we will. We also see veterans who say, I have served and lived my life honorably, and if there comes a point when I can no longer interact with my friends and family and can no longer contribute to this beautiful world, then please let me go. And we'll honor that too. Sometimes these decisions, no matter which way they go, cause distress for others. For the veteran who wants us to do everything to try to save him, sometimes that makes family members or staff wonder how much suffering is worth it to prolong life. For the veteran who describes being ready to leave this world, family members often struggle with not being ready to let her go. We have different values, goals, priorities, even in families, sometimes especially in families, and these conflicts are real and wrenching. What my team tries to remind people gently in these situations is that it's not about us. It is that veteran, that dear person in front of us, whose values matter here. We each have both the right to and responsibility for choosing how to live our lives. And both making and honoring those choices at the end of our lives is a privilege. But here's the thing about values. We don't always wear them on our sleeves. In fact, sometimes we don't even know ourselves what we stand for. Political candidates try to convince us of our shared values, and as a result, get us to align our land with theirs, right? Support them on account of similar interests. Sometimes we learn about our values when we move away from home and see things differently for the first time, or when we meet new people who will challenge our thinking. Sometimes we are explicit with those conversations. James and I had one of those talks early in our relationship because, both having had starter marriages, we wanted to make sure this time that our values were aligned in such a way as to give us a better chance of making this a lifetime commitment. 15 years in, I'm happy to report, so far so good. But there are no guarantees in life. I'm very comfortable that I know who I am and what I stand for, and who James is and what he values. And yet, there is a possible world where he surprises me. It is unlikely, but not impossible, that he could have a commitment that fundamentally undermines my commitments. Now, I don't mean to say that we agree on everything. 2 words, Patriot Act. Yet, kiddish again. Yet those disagreements are not about values, but rather about how we exercise those values. And that's what makes for interesting conversation, right, around the dinner table. There's an old adage that says people show you who they are. Believe them. If we look closely, if we listen, we can sometimes figure out what people value. But you know what else works? Asking them. That's how I started to learn what James valued. And I don't mean ask people which political candidates they support or where they stand on hot button issues, although those things can be illustrative. I mean really get to know people. Ask them their stories. Find out where they come from, how they got to where they are now. Discover what makes them overjoyed and what drives them to despair. Find out what matters to them. That's why George R.R. Martin was still introducing new characters hundreds of pages in, because there are many opportunities to make connections in life, and it's often completely opaque who will play a major role from the beginning. Theon Greyjoy, really? There are all sorts of ways to get to know people, and every day we have the chance to understand each other's values and to clarify our own. Because the lesson from Pinchas isn't simply that we have to know the numbers so that we can marshal our resources. The lesson is that the numbers are only the beginning of the story. That's why Joshua gets identified as the leader right after the tally, because now that we know the whole, we've got to get back to individuals, and we have to figure out how to live with each other. I challenge you this week, as you're watching the news or reading a blog about current events, to think about the situation not as merely a recounting of numbers like the census, but rather to view those numbers as merely the beginning of a story about individuals, each of whom has a why, each of whom has a series of values, and who act, even if implicitly, according to what matters to them. What matters to you? Shabbat Shalom.